think Sandra. Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started here in just a minute. Get the panelists to join me on stage. That would be great.
Is there an order to this?
Wherever you like. Stevie, aren't you on the panel? Are you on? Good morning, everyone. So, welcome. I'm James Hildreth, President and CEO of Meharry Medical College, an HIV researcher since 1986. And today, of course, is World AIDS Day. And more importantly, we're celebrating 30 years of wonderful work by Reverend Edwin Sanders and the First Response Center, which is one of the first HIV clinics to be established in the church in the United States. And of course, Reverend Sanders was one of the first faith leaders to openly embrace the fight against AIDS in the setting of a church. So it's a very historic day, and we're happy to have you all here for this symposium, where we're going to reflect back on what has happened, but also consider things that we can do moving forward. I'm especially delighted to welcome very special guests from Zambia. Ambassador Kanyama, who's here with us. Ambassador, could you please stand, and your wife, all the way from Zambia. I'm really proud of the work that my team is doing in Zambia, led by Dr. Matthews Juarez, Paul Juarez, Dr. Chiro, Dr. Berthold here sitting in front. So I was on my way to becoming a transplant surgeon at Johns Hopkins Medical School. When I did my first rotation in internal medicine, one of the first patients I took care of was a young black woman, 22 years old, I believe, who had HIV, and she's just given birth to a baby. They were both HIV positive, and at the time, there was nothing we could do for them. But my mentors had me understand that this is going to be a significant problem, and as an immunologist and a person of color, I might want to think about making this my career choice. And that's what I did. So seeing that young lady struggle with HIV the way that she did, and the baby, had a profound impact on me. And I was pretty certain it's going to be a major problem for people of color, and it turned out to be the case. So that's how my journey with HIV started, taking care of someone who was profoundly affected by the disease. So we're going to jump right into our symposium. I'm really proud to share the stage with some friends and colleagues who have joined us. These are some very distinguished investigators who've been involved in this fight for a very long time, and I want to introduce them. To my immediate left here is Dr. C.V. Dash, who is the director of the HIV Center for AIDS Research and Health Disparities here at Meharry Medical College. We got Dr. David Haas, who is the one of the directors of the Tennessee CFAR. It's a collaboration between Meharry, Vanderbilt, and the State Health Department. And my long-standing friend, one of the true warriors in HIV research, Dr. Barney Graham, who's now at Morehouse School of Medicine. And then last but not least, of course, is Wakefield, who came all the way from Seattle to be with us today. So we can give our panel a hand, please. So I really want to start with Wakefield. Just want each of you to reflect on some thoughts about where we've come from and where we are now. Just please.
Do we have a timer?
I don't see anybody with a timer. So
It's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to be with all of you today. I actually am somebody who was involved as a volunteer at a small underground clinic in Chicago called the Howard Brown Clinic. We partnered with the health department to do STI testing. And back then we called it STDs. On Tuesday night and Thursday night, we would hang sheets in this storefront, and because gay men couldn't say who they were to their doctors. They were still going to the family doctor, and they were having burning sensations by Tuesday night, what they'd been doing on Saturday night. So we were at this small community-based clinic. Dr. Graham will remember Ken Mayer from Boston. He was in residency at Northwestern Hospital at the time. And as a volunteer there, I was able to learn how to be a phlebotomist. What happened for us was we partnered with the health department. So that's where I learned to partner with government. So that people wouldn't have to have their syphilis reported publicly in the local newspaper. And we found a company that was testing hepatitis B vaccines because 1 in 5 gay men had hepatitis B at the time, and we could provide them with patients and participants in their studies, and that gave me my interest in vaccines. I'm still a volunteer. I was working in chemical manufacturing. A couple of years later, after we had found the hepatitis B vaccine, along comes this thing called GRID, gay-related immune deficiency. We thought, well, why is it called GRID? And I said, oh, you can call it 4-H. And I said, 4-H? Well, it's homosexuals, hemophiliacs, heroin users, I'm forgetting.
Patients.
Oh, Haitians, right.
We have Vladimir will remind.
And it was like, are you people crazy? This is about a medical issue, not about an identity or a sexuality. Anyway, I left being a volunteer and as a person in the clinic, and got involved with the board of directors of that organization. And I remember our social worker coming to us saying, you know, we just need $2,000 for this little problem we're going to solve, and we're going to call it the AIDS Action Project. It was $2,000, and we thought, we debated, should we give her the money? What can we do? That was my beginning in HIV, long before we even know to call it AIDS. Fortunately, over the years, and I want the other panelists to be able to talk, but what I can tell you is that as somebody living in the city of Chicago, our friends were dying, we didn't know what to do. So it's really important on a day like today, when they say let communities lead, for me to talk about communities were leading. The responses were being led, not just by people who were volunteers in communities, by physicians who could see their way to doing work that no one else was willing to do, by people who understood this was not normal life, and I'll tell more personal stories later. But over the years, my career has taken me to being on the Chicago Board of Health as the HIV guy. And I got in trouble there because I said, what do you mean the HIV guy? We got low birth rate in the city of Chicago. Chicago has enough money, we should have no low birth rate. I said, and you're telling these young women they can't spend their money at McDonald's? They need to eat, they need nutrition. and so I've always been the guy who said the thing that was out of the box. And then I ended up one day at a meeting at NIH and I said, you need a community advisory board. They said, we never had one. I said, well, you do now, you need one. And they said, well, who's going to chair it? I said, I don't know, I'll do it for a year. And I've ended up on lots of committees at NIH over the years and at NIAID, and finally spent the last 20 years of my career working in HIV vaccine research at the Fred Hutch Cancer Center and leading our community engagement process there. I have lots of stories. What I can tell you about today is it's a great time to remember that communities have led from the beginning. When there weren't systems, when there was not a budget from the federal government, when there was not a budget from any organization like a Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, we had to lead because somebody had to show up. And I'll close with this because our colleagues are here from Zambia. I remember my first trip to Uganda to talk about the ethics of vaccine research and community engagement. I was an old man at 45. There weren't any people in my age group on the streets because the epidemic had wiped out a whole generation of people. The joy for me was we were able to talk about vaccines and prevention as hope. And where we are today is we have lots of interventions. We haven't figured out how to get them into community, but it'll be community folks that'll help us figure out how to get them out there and how to make things happen. And I'm going to stop because I will let somebody else talk.
Thank you, Wakefield. Dr. Graham?
Well, probably the world will remember me most for COVID and RSV vaccines, but my real friends know that almost everything in my professional life has been driven by HIV. And when I was chief resident at General Hospital back in 1982, I saw the first AIDS patient. We didn't know it was AIDS then, but I saw the first AIDS patient in Tennessee. And I still remember all of his diagnoses that were multiple and his name and the whole story. So HIV has been a series of very emotional events, and they were very personal. It's almost hard to talk about because between 1982 and 1996, everybody you saw with HIV died. And I ended up leaving Vanderbilt in 2000 to go to the NIH Vaccine Research Center to help start a new program to make an HIV vaccine. And reflecting back on that, I realized that some of the motivation for that was related to those personal experiences where there was a young woman who was at TSU who probably got HIV from her very first boyfriend and who was salutatorian of her high school class, very promising young woman who wanted to go to medical school, but this interrupted her, and she spent the next several years of being an advocate, a first voice, a first person program where she probably saved more people from HIV than any of the rest of us doing science at that time, because she went all over the state to talk to high school students. She got very sick, but in 1996, we finally had better antivirals, and when she started on those, it resuscitated her from, near death, cryptococcal meningitis and the whole thing. And And she had one very good year, but then finally died in 1997. And I think that death is what led me to leave Vanderbilt and my friends here in Nashville to go to NIH. So even the science, you can track back all the way to the beginning. HIV vaccine science, even though we still don't have an HIV vaccine, has driven all the technologies that have been used to solve the COVID problem and the RSV problem and lots of other things along the way, and has pretty much built the whole field of immunology. So working on HIV vaccines has changed a lot of things, even though we still don't have an HIV vaccine.
Thank you, Dr. Ram. Dr. Haas?
I'll say it's a great honor to be here, and I'll mention first, the reason I'm late is, I don't know if folks have Microsoft, but I find that if I'm in a different time zone, and I put something on my calendar, it goes in that time zone. So I would have been on time if we were in New York. I would have been on time. So I'll just give a couple personal reflections. And like Barney, I remember very well the first patient that I was involved in caring for in the 1980s, and it was a veteran who came into the clinic with foot drop. One of his feet wasn't working right, and somebody had tested him, and he was HIV positive. He looked perfectly healthy, nicest guy in the world, but as Barney said, we looked at him and said, "You're going to be dead. There's nothing we can do. We have nothing." It was right around the time when AZT was going into clinical trials as monotherapy, and sure enough, he passed away. And in my mind, I remember very well back then, I didn't see any chance that there would ever be a treatment for this. I really thought this was going to be a death sentence for the foreseeable future and for decades to come. And then, fast forwarding to now, where we have amazing treatments, amazing treatments, but the challenges are very different. So earlier this morning, I was at our case conference where we present patients who are being started or changed on their HIV therapy, and just two people just this morning being presented. One is a law enforcement officer from another state who contracted HIV in the way people often contract HIV, and he cannot get HIV care in his home state because he is afraid of stigma and all that. So he's coming to Nashville to get his care, and he's doing very well in treatment. But because of all the stigma, he doesn't want to take pills every day. He wants to take shots once a month. But the problem is we can't get the shots for him. They're available, but they're too expensive. Insurance won't cover it oftentimes. So we're challenged with this situation. Fortunately, he's doing very well taking his pills, and I expect him to do very well. The next person who was presented after him was a young woman who is very, very challenged with substance use, has been in and out of incarceration, has had 3 children who've been taken away from her, and she has extremely treatable HIV infection. She will not take her medicine no matter what we do. There's no way for us to give her a long-acting drug to help her live. And at this conference, there are about 20 people from across the state and elsewhere, and we're racking our brains, and we don't know what to do for this woman other than she receives her care in Jackson, Tennessee, and so she's being placed in hospice. This 30-year-old woman with a completely treatable disease because of the failure of her not being able to take a medication every day. So these are just a couple of the challenges that we deal with. And maybe we'll get into this later, but on top of this, I'll just mention, in the past year or so, the state of Tennessee has been a jewel in the crown of HIV, the state health department, in our response to the HIV pandemic. Compared to other health departments, the impact that the state health department has had has just been profound, incredible leadership. But because of decisions that have been made that we're aware of at the state level, this infrastructure is really being challenged and shattered, and some of the finest people I know have left the state because of this. So these are things that you can't flip a switch and fix. So these are some of the challenges we deal with despite having amazing treatments. So if I were diagnosed with HIV today, I'd be upset, but I would be incredibly upset because I would know that if I took one pill once a day, I'd probably live to be as old as I would otherwise. But that's just me.
Thank you, David. Dr. Dash.
Well, it's been a great honor to see everybody here. I'm looking forward to meet all of you tomorrow, those who are coming for a tour to our center, which Dr. Hildreth was the founding director, and I'm very proud of following the footsteps. So my perspective has been from training the next generation of scientists, physicians, and health professionals, those who are not only tooled but also informed to make a difference. And I'll give you one example that sticks all the time and why perhaps Mehari was the most attractive place to come. Dr. Hildreth, you were number one, but for me to choose to come here. But I go to Cold Spring Harbor retrovirus meeting because I'm a basic scientist in training. And almost 700 to 800 researchers, physicians, scientists, other health professionals come to this conference throughout all over the world. And I think it's almost, 17 years ago when I went for the first time. And it was quickly very clear among the 700 people, you can count how many black and brown scientists, physicians who attend or trained in those conferences. And this is the so-called holy grail of retroviruses, where all the top technology, cutting-edge science, advances done. Now imagine if you're trying to make a difference within the community, you got to train the next scientist, next healthcare professional from the community. And that was one of the biggest motivation for me and what has made this so fulfilling. And I must mention this, I'm so proud of the 6 PhD students I have trained who have come in here, and almost every year Mehari represents HIV/AIDS research with a platform presentation. It's been uniquely satisfying and humbling. And my goal has been, even though it is difficult these days to attract next generation of scientists to physicians to stay in academia, it's critical not only train them from the science perspective, but how HIV/AIDS gives you a platform to learn politics, economics, global culture, and it's not a disease alone. It teaches you how human behavior works. And this is the right time. We have all the fundamental tools, and the next generation is incredibly intelligent. Only thing is there is too much of information and how we filter. So that has been my goal, and I think we are in the right path, and we will make great progress.
One of the hallmarks of the HIV/AIDS pandemic in the beginning, and 2 of our panelists have mentioned this, the stigma associated with having HIV. And I've already mentioned that in the faith community, they didn't want any part of it, because when HIV was given the name GRID, or gay-related immunodeficiency, at the time in 1981 in our country, that was thought to be the result of sin, that homosexuality was viewed as a sin. And our president at the time didn't mention HIV publicly for more than 7 years. And it took the death of one of his actor friends, Rock Hudson, to change that. And one would think that if Rock Hudson had not died, who knows how long it would have taken to get the nation's attention about this. So my question is, do you think that the stigma or the attitudes of the public toward HIV, or people living with HIV, has changed? Is it better in that respect, or are we where we were? David?
So that's a very complicated question. And I think overall it has improved. There's no doubt that overall it has improved in many circles. I know groups of people that if someone were diagnosed with HIV, they'd be open about it. Many people are open about it, supportive of each other. But but one thing that I'm very concerned about is that what we're witnessing in our current larger society is things can change very quickly. So whereas there was not long ago, a great deal of support for the LGBTQ community, now that is kind of swinging the other direction, and it's becoming politically unfavorable to be supportive of the LGBT community in some circles. And whether you're aware of it or not, Tennessee is ground zero for the culture wars in this area. And Nashville in particular is ground zero for the culture wars. So many groups around the country, kind of large social media people with massive followings, are moving their operations to Tennessee and to Nashville because they see this as where they can fight this. So I'm very, very concerned that there's going to be a lot of political capital in creating more stigma, in creating more alienation, and creating more division between people, because this gets clicks on the media, it gets in the news. And it's hard for me to think of any other disease that has the stigma that HIV does, even after all these years. So I think overall it is better, but it's fragile, and I think for many, many groups, it is still, the stigma is massive. And within families, the stigma is within massive families where, individuals don't share their status with their spouse. Children don't share it with their parents. I'm not sure I answered the question, but those are my thoughts.
Anyone else want to add anything to that?
Oh, can I say one more thing? Real quick.
Sure.
So James brought up the faith community, and I think that the faith community plays a huge role in us dealing with this. Many people turn to the faith community for guidance, for support. It's their home base, it's their anchor. And as Reverend Sanders knows, for years we've been working to try to get a groundswell of effort in this area, which is really taking root. So I think that is a big place where the faith community can either be allies and partners, or cannot be helpful, and those are choices we have to make.
I want to add to that. I agree about the stigma about someone having to reveal their sexuality. But we live in a very different society in terms of healthcare messaging. How many of you have heard of Skyrizi?
What?
Skyrizi, oral Ozempic. These are drugs. You go to your doctor and you ask your doctor to give it to you. People that are diabetic know about Ozempic. When it comes to HIV, you're not going to go in and ask for something to help you prevent HIV. We have a pill a day that a person can take that will guarantee they will never, or I shouldn't say guarantee, 99.9% never be infected with HIV if they take it every day. I took mine this morning. I don't want to become infected with HIV. That pill is available as a very expensive pill. It's as a not so expensive pill, and it's available as a generic. I take the generic because the company can't convince me that I need an expensive pill. I know a little bit about the science, but when someone asked me about taking it, my sister had said, "Can't you just tell people you're taking heart medicine?" She's worried about the stigma for her, not the stigma for me. So I think because we live in a different world in terms of medications and people are used to asking for help, we've got to learn to do something different around preventive medicine in order to deal with the tools that we have in terms of HIV. And I'm not convinced we need more expensive tools, or we need to proliferate something where you take a shot in the butt every 6 months, because at the cost of what it costs you for 4 months rent, it may not be worth it. But we've got to help people learn that they can prevent HIV if they're at risk for HIV. They got to know they're at risk. The way we talk, it's one thing to be at risk for a skin problem or for obesity. It's a very different thing in our society to be at risk for sexually transmitted infection.
Anybody else want to add anything? Okay. So we've just come through, in my opinion, we're not quite completely through it, but the world shut down for more than 2 years when SARS-CoV-2 came on the scene, and we had a second pandemic or a third pandemic to deal with, depending on who you talk with. Do you think that there were any lessons that we didn't apply that we could have applied from fighting HIV to fighting COVID-19? And I would ask Dr. Graham to start with that, because I have some very strong opinions about American exceptionalism, but I'll let him get started first.
Well, I don't even know if we've learned it after going through COVID. So, I mean, almost all pandemic threats, including HIV, including COVID, start out as regional problems. And so it's in the best interest of high-income countries to invest in and partner with low-income countries, because the work for surveillance and the work on solving regional problems need to happen in a regional way. If we had kept institutions alive like the Ugandan Virology Research Institute in Entebbe, for instance, during the 1960s and 70s, I have a sense that they probably would have found HIV 10 or 15 years before it was found, and everything would have changed. And so we didn't really learn that lesson in HIV, and even now, even though there's a lot of infections still happening, I think 1.3 per year infections. It used to be 5,000. We used to have a mantra at the VRC, 14,000 infections a day. You don't ever let a piece of paper sit on your desk overnight. So it was always in a hurry at the VRC. But even though there's still a lot of infections, there's a threat of funding being withdrawn for HIV. And as many of the people here who work on the PEPFAR program know, that program is at risk. And even with the tools we have now that could prevent, almost all children from becoming infected, there's still 130,000 children infected every year,
Right.
which is, to me, completely unacceptable. And so we haven't really learned that the threat of infectious diseases that are occurring anywhere are a risk to all of us everywhere. And so that lesson still hasn't been learned. We didn't get the vaccines out fast enough to the world during COVID. We could have immunized everyone in 6 months instead of 6 years that it's going to take. We probably could have stopped the Delta wave,
Yes.
all the other variants that have come along since then. So we are still not really getting it, that we're all in this together, and that we have to figure out ways of partnering, and the high-income countries need to understand that it's in their best interest to do that.
That's a really good point, Barney, because at one point when, I don't know, tens of millions or lots of people in the United States have been vaccinated, there were countries in Africa that had less than 2% of the people vaccinated, and that's unacceptable. But anyone else have any thoughts about lessons we should have applied from COVID-19 from HIV to COVID-19?
Well, I think a lesson we will learn is around vaccine hesitancy, because despite the fact that we have an incredibly effective COVID vaccine, as we all know, there's lots of hesitancy. Right now, we don't have an HIV vaccine. We think that if we had an HIV vaccine, it would transform everything, but what we learned from COVID is it might not, because people might not be willing to take it, and there might be a lot of pushback. So this is where community partnerships come in, are incredibly important. To anticipate and be way ahead of the curve, not just for COVID or HIV, but whatever the next pandemic is that is coming.
Dr. Hilgert, the way you asked the question sounds like you might have an answer. Would you mind sharing your thoughts?
I have a strong opinion, but I don't know that I have an answer. Some of you may know that I served on President Biden's Health Equity Task Force for COVID-19. I also serve on the VRPAC, which reviews vaccines for approval, and AMDAC, which reviews drugs for approval. And in that, serving in those capacities, became very clear to me that politics and science just cannot be allowed to conflate. When we were reviewing the vaccine for children 6 months to 5 years old, there's always a public comment period in the middle of the day. We meet all day from 8 to 5. And at lunchtime, people from the public can sign up to make comments. In this particular case, a sitting congressman from Georgia, who I won't name, got onto the call and said, when we take over Congress again, we're going to hold you scientists responsible for killing children. Can you imagine being threatened in that way by someone who sits in Congress who might actually have the ability to do what he threatened to do? My point is, the politics in all of this was a major problem in what I call American exceptionalism. Some of the decisions we made were made much too late if we had just accepted the science that was being done outside of our borders. Because scientists are a global community. We all collaborate, and that's part of what we do. But for whatever reason, it seemed to me that the politics of all this got in the way of us solving some problems sooner. So I call it American exceptionalism. That's, to me, was part of our problem. The other problem is we had a leader who at the time was kind of like Reagan. You remember that Reagan didn't acknowledge the problem until tens of thousands of people had already died, I believe, or at least been infected. And number 45 stood up and said, it's just flu, it's going to go away. And at the time, millions of people had been infected, hundreds of thousands had died. So I don't know if it's which one is the elephant? And which one is the donkey? The elephants are now trying to do away with the most effective program for saving lives that has ever been created. Tens of millions of people are alive because of PEPFAR. Why in the world would you want to discontinue that? But I'm going to leave that alone because I'm getting a little emotional here. And it was started by one of the elephants. So let's move on.
I don't blame you for getting emotional. One of the challenges is, even with Reagan, till his own friend died, it was not an issue for him. And so, it's, Marnie just sort of said under his breath, it has to be personal. I don't know if you heard that all the way out there, but it's, an Australian once said to me, he said, we realize Australia was founded as a penal colony. And we admit it. You guys in America were founded on Puritanism, and you will never, ever admit it. And sometimes I worry that that's true.
Probably is true. And there's some parallels here because I did press conferences as part of the mayor's task force for COVID-19. And I believe at the time 100,000 people had died. And when it became obvious, based on the data, that this would be a problem that mostly affects people who are brown and black, there was a perceptible change in focus and emphasis from the people who lead this country. The same thing was true for the drug abuse and all this. It didn't become a real problem until, let's just
Keep going, Jimmy.
let's just move on.
Dr. Hildreth, if I may just
Sure.
make one point on a positive note, actually. We saw during COVID times the results of the investments made in basic science and fundamental discoveries, and how the process of making a vaccine, which used to take more than years, could be retooled, utilizing the resources, infrastructure, and the intelligence of the HIV/AIDS and other communities to at least design and deliver a vaccine within a period of time that was unprecedented. And that could not have been done without the investments that were made, if not 50 years ago, 25 years ago, in real fundamental science. So I think one of the key things for me to learn is, even though we do not realize how it translates, investment in infrastructure, basic science, and next generation of scientists will play a key role in preventing future pandemics and any infectious diseases we can pursue.
Dr. Haas mentioned earlier that we have some amazing treatments and interventions now for HIV, including an injectable cocktail of 2 drugs that will protect you for 2 months, which is extraordinary. In the beginning, you had to take 13 or 14 pills at just the right time during the day, and it was just too much and people were not very compliant. So my question is, with all these interventions available to us, what's the best strategy for making the best use of them? How do we have these tools, they're amazing, the result of some amazing science. How do we use them? How do we make sure they do what they're designed to do? Anybody?
I'm going to give an additional comment on your last question that can be applied to this question.
Okay.
But, as CV said, the science that HIV vaccine attempts created, the structure-based vaccine design and all the tools we had to work on COVID and let it be so fast, that science really has carried forward from HIV. I wrote an editorial in the New York Times on the 3rd anniversary of the pandemic, and even though the science has progressed, the policy and practice that we haven't kept up. And so, as a society grows, different elements tend to grow at different paces, but we have a massive amount of work to do to try to get the policy and practice, which is basically the politics, to catch it up with what we can do now scientifically. And how to get that to happen is something that I'm grappling with, but I don't really have a good answer for.
Dr. Haas?
One of the biggest amongst the challenges are people actually knowing that they are HIV positive. So you can't get treated for HIV if you don't know you're positive. So much more extensive education, awareness, testing, home testing, all the things that can be done to make sure people know they're HIV positive. One of the most challenging things, and I'm not on the front lines taking care of lots of patients. I primarily do clinical research and am involved with patients in research, but I'm involved in a lot of the decision making. The hardest thing is that we have the most convoluted medical healthcare system in the world that is so fragmented and difficult to navigate. So oftentimes our challenges with the patients being presented is not what do they get treated with, but it's how in the world do we figure out how to get them their medication, and we have to try to get vouchers from the companies and all these things. We accept it's normal. We accept that this is the way it's supposed to be. One time I was traveling with my wife in Ireland, and she lost some of her medication, and she said, "Oh no, I lost my medication. We need to go to the drugstore." And I'm thinking, "Oh, this is going to be a nightmare," because I'm thinking in the U.S. we're going to have to find a practitioner, a provider, set up something, and we're going to have to spend 2 days of our vacation trying to get her medication. So we go to the drugstore, and we walk in, and the pharmacist says, "Oh no, let me just give you some. I have some samples back here. Let me just give you enough. This will get you through your trip." And I'm thinking, this is what healthcare should be like. It shouldn't be this incredibly complicated thing we have to navigate. So that's part of it. I'll just say another big part is just having the infrastructure, the clinics, the community health centers, all these groups that are well-staffed, well-equipped, well-educated to be there to be able to provide for patients and follow through. There's no substitute for that.
Wakefield, Dr. Graham, any?
I'm just, one of the things I know is that probably everybody in this room remembers a day when they were at home with everybody and we didn't have a COVID test. We now have a test. most of us have a COVID test someplace in one of our cabinets. If our family members all get it at the same time, we're going to run out. We can't even go on Amazon and order a COVID test. So we, as I think has been alluded to, is we have to change our healthcare system to be one where when we know science, we can respond to science. And the challenge with that is there are the liars out there that are going to say the science doesn't work. So we have to figure out who are the right spokespersons for the way forward. I don't want to be back in my apartment locked up.
Well, at one point, the CDC was trying to switch from an opt-in for HIV test when you went to see your PC, primary care physician, to an opt-out. In other words, unless you opted out, you got tested. The problem with that is that if we have universal testing for HIV and someone tests positive and we can't offer them treatment for HIV, to me that's unethical, right? Why would you do that? Why would you diagnose something that could be life-ending but not have anything to offer that person? That is, to me, paints the picture of where we are in these United States. We spend $4.3 trillion with a T on healthcare, which I call sick care, every year. If we just could save 10% of that, that's $430 billion. Everybody living with HIV, actually almost around the world, could get free HIV drugs. And the drug company can still make a profit. And we're the only country, developed country, where public health and healthcare are thought as two separate things. We got a lot of work to do. But let's move on, because I'm trying to get in my feelings here. So, this is a good one. So if you could, if you had the authority to do so, is there something in our policies in the United States or legislation that you would enact that you think would have the most profound effect on this problem here in the United States?
So is universal health care, is that an option?
Yes.
I think that is the one, that is the one biggest thing, is universal health care provision.
Since you're asking us to dream about things, I've always thought that healthcare and education, it should be illegal to make a profit from those two fundamental things that we do. That making a profit from healthcare or making a profit from education should just be illegal. And that would solve many of them.
And if I may add, again, I think the scientific budget for NIH should be non-partisan, like defense budget, where it is adjusted to the inflationary cost and it is not subjective to why we have to pay tax dollars for basic science. Many a times when we are unaware of the implications or the applications of basic science, we question. In the age of information on our fingertips, it causes more harm, because if you lose a well-trained scientist, physician, then retraining somebody to bring back takes so much time, and those time are really valuable.
Yeah.
So if I had a chance to tell somebody, I would make them that NIH budget should be non-partisan.
Absolutely. Wakefield, you have a dream you want to dream?
I've heard some really wonderful things here, but they seem so hard for us, almost impossible, at least for our society. And my challenge is, we have people, we live in a world today where you can tell a lie, and if you have enough money, your lie is considered the truth. You can promote your lie. And that for me is always, one of my favorite moments during COVID is 45 was standing at the podium, and Tony Fauci's head is like this, and Deborah Birx says, he's the head of the military, and I'm a military person. We've got to find a way to get the truth out there about whatever it is, and have science be considered valid and useful in ways that those of us in this room, we respect science. We wouldn't be in this room if we didn't today. But people that tell lies should be punished for the lies that they tell if they've hurt other people. And I think that's not going to happen too soon, or at least not soon enough. So those of us that have an opportunity, every now and then we got to get on a soapbox. A couple of days ago was Shirley Chisholm's birthday, or anniversary of her birthday. And she always said, if they don't make room for you at the table, bring a chair. We got to bring our chairs. We got to vote. We got to go to meetings that we think we don't have time to go to, and stand up for truth when we know what the truth is.
Is that where the amen goes?
Amen.
Could I make one comment?
Sure, of course.
So this is just a fact that people may not be aware of. So Barney commented on for-profit healthcare, and people in this room may not know that across the United States, for-profit healthcare started just down the street from here. Hospital Corporation of America, the first for-profit hospital in the country, was a project of some Vanderbilt trained physicians who had patients in the hospital. They didn't have a place to send them when they went, so they bought a hospital and started to send patients to the hospital. They realized we can make a lot of money doing this. Their names included Frist and other folks. And so the start, Hospital Corporation of America, which became Columbia, which became TriStar, it was so the start of for-profit healthcare hospitals started right here in Nashville.
So one of the things that Dr. Graham and I were speaking about earlier is we're like, 40 some years into this. And most of the people who have the most funding for HIV research are of our generation. So we are concerned that if we don't find a way to bring new blood and young, energetic scientists into the fight against HIV, that in a few years, when at some point we got to retire, right, Barney? We know David Wakefield's already retired. God bless him. So at some point, we're going to hang up our pipettes and, put our microscopes aside and do some other things, fish or garden or whatever. So what do we need to do to get more young investigators involved in HIV research? Or do you think it's a problem? Maybe it's just me. So what are your thoughts about that?
Well, it's not just HIV. It's really academic medicine, academic research, in general. And I had one of my most talented graduate students tell me a couple years ago that she didn't want to do a postdoc, she wanted to be a project manager, because she didn't want to spend 10 years being an underpaid postdoc and have a 6% chance of having an independent faculty position. And so somehow we have to convince people, and the COVID story is a great example that investment in basic science, and I'm sure CB would agree with that, investment in basic science is one of our best possible investments, because it not only invests in things we need to know about, but it invests in the young people that we need to have present to solve these problems. And that investment needs to be across the board. We need to make sure that everybody from all sectors, even from all over the world, has a chance to reach their full potential of what they can contribute to these future problems. Because we have the scientific tools, we just don't have the investment in basic science and the investment in young people to pursue them. And so most of the people who have the money for HIV research saw this during their training, just like me and James did. We've stuck with it, but the generation behind us has developed a whole new set of interests. So there's going to be a collapse of HIV expertise coming up, and it's going to turn into malaria and TB, which are also dramatic problems that are not funded well enough.
CP?
Yeah, I think we are going through a transformation of lack of interest in scientific discovery and in terms of why someone should be motivated to endure this so-called tough and unpredictable career. And I think the older generation has a lot of blame to do with it, including myself, even though I may not be that old. But I think the doom and gloom of funding has a tremendous impact on the new generation. They hear all the time how difficult it is to get an idea put together, not only put together, then get it through. I'm sure everybody in this panel has served on NIH or any other study sections that evaluate grants. Not a single grant, I should not say, rarely a single grant gets through in the first submission. And it does not matter whether you are first time or you're a Nobel Prize winner. I think we got to deliberately change this narrative that this is going to be one of the best opportunity to invest, because as you see, many young talented people are shying away from science. That means come in 10 years, we will have a vacuum of talent that are needed to solve these problems. And you cannot train a young generation of scientists, physicians in a year or two. I think in addition to highlighting the problems, severe problems, that's why I was saying NIH funding should be nonpartisan. We should highlight the opportunities in this struggle. And it has to be one-on-one. One of the key things I say to my trainees, look from where I have come, and if I can do it, and I'm not as intelligent as the next generation in talent, in information, in collaboration, in the tools. I still remember, Dr. Hildreth, where you have to make tris hydrochloride and pour your own gels and then wait for the gel to polymerize, then you will load the gel and see tomorrow, then plan. Now you come back, you can do everything in 1 hour. That's how the opportunities are to make a difference, that you can eliminate all these noise pretty quickly. But for that, we really need decisive action, how to promote these ideas about opportunities. In addition to academic science, we should also inform them other opportunities, because that's what we do not do. When you train a scientist, it's the skills that acquire is applicable to many different areas. I think we do not do that effectively. I think we can do it. The younger generation is not getting the right mentoring or information for them to get excited.
We have some reflectors, I think that's what you all are called, in the audience. I'm going to call them up in just a minute, but before I do, UNAIDS came up with a strategy to put an end to the HIV/AIDS pandemic by 2030. They've now moved it a bit by something called 90-90-90. I'm sure most of you might be familiar with that. The idea would be to identify 90% of the persons infected with HIV, get 90% of those persons on antiretroviral therapy, and achieve suppression in 90% of the people who are treated. And a mathematical model shows that if you did that, in some number of years, HIV as a problem would go away. So that's their plan for ending the epidemic, the pandemic. So I want each of you to reflect on what you think it's going to take to bring an end to the pandemic. Wakefield, would you start?
Such a shy person. Of course I'll start. I'm really challenged because we live in an information age. Information changes regularly. We set this as a goal. As we've said, we may have to change our reward systems in academia. We can't admit to ourselves that this is not an achievable goal. If you look at the data that came out from UNAIDS 2 days ago, there are countries where there are actual increases in the number of new HIV infections. We haven't learned to update our ability to talk about our goals and our strategies and still continue with the funding. The problem is right now is if you're being funded to help end the epidemic by that date and you say you're working on anything else, your funding is threatened. And so I don't believe we can achieve that goal. I also think we have to talk about HIV differently. We have to talk about the entire field of medical science differently. Those of you that are clinicians know that you give your patients this result called a complete blood count. There's still hundreds of people out there that believe if they've had a CBC, they have an HIV test. They don't have to worry about HIV. It's not complete, but that's how we talk about it. So I think there's a lot we can do, but I with regard to the goal, I wish we could be more modern and admit that that's not an achievable goal. Even though we have all the tools, we don't have the implementation science to support that goal.
So Wakefield, are you saying that you don't think we can achieve the goal of putting HIV behind us as a pandemic?
I believe, well, maybe as a pandemic, but as I don't believe we'll achieve the goals of 90, 90, and 90 because we don't inform the people who are most at risk about the tools that we have in an implementation way that would make them pick up that tool and use it.
So 90, 90, 90 is not the path forward. What would you suggest as an alternative?
That's not an off-the-cuff question. I would suggest, though, that we would convene the scientists and the communities to talk about what realistically can we expect, by 2025, then by 2028, then by 20. We've set this goal out there, and we pretend that somehow or another we failed. We live in a fantastic world scientifically. We live in a fantastic world medically. No matter what I've said to complain about any of the way things are working, we have done a miraculous job. I don't worry about somebody who walks up to me and says, I'm HIV positive, dying tomorrow or dying in 6 months. I'm not planning on going to their funeral. But we also haven't told people that are at risk how to avoid being at risk. We've continued to make it challenging because of the stigma we talked about at the beginning of our conversation. And we've got to do something different. And if I had that solution, I'd be across the water in Seattle at Bill Gates' house saying, give me the money, show me the money.
Dr. Graham, how can we put an end to this?
Well, for the last 40 years, I would be saying we need a vaccine.
Yes.
We will not have a vaccine by 2030 for HIV. And we may never have a vaccine, but working on a vaccine,
I agree.
if we can keep working on an HIV vaccine, it will solve all the other biological problems we need to solve, all the other viruses that ever come up anywhere. So working on a vaccine is still important, but in my current role as I'm now the director of the David Satcher Global Health Equity Institute at Morehouse, and one of the big problems is just having stable, organized, committed governments. So I think Botswana and Tanzania and Rwanda have achieved 90-90-90. Some countries have achieved 90-90-90. And if that could be sustained everywhere, but we are not taking care of young girls in South Africa. We're not taking care of the babies, 130,000 babies born every year with HIV. We have hit a plateau with just antiviral prevention. We need to have monoclonal antibodies, which are easily feasible for those young infants. And so we've sort of hit this plateau where we have stopped investing and utilizing even the things we know how to do. And so we need stable governments, and we need investment in science and trials.
Very good. Dr. House?
Yeah, so I think one thing that is really important is that HIV not be approached in a silo, not be approached as a one-off, that it be approached as integral to so many other aspects of health care and health prevention. There are so many great examples of this, but the interactions between HIV, mental health, substance use, cardiovascular disease, obesity, comorbidities, hepatitis, renal disease. I mean, the list goes on and on. Perinatal care. I mean, there's so many of these things. We've seen globally in places where a lot of effort and funding is put into HIV, that it not only improves HIV care, but it raises the bar for everything, for diagnostics, for other infections, for hypertension, diabetes, all these things. So I think that that in approaching this, we need to really focus on identifying ways to address this holistically. Because if we were in another auditorium and people were diabetologists, they would be having this same conversation maybe, but it would be entirely about diabetes, perhaps. So I think that's both a way forward and a way to get buy-in from stakeholders. And if I didn't mention the community is integral to everything that happens. Nothing happens without the community.
If I put my non-scientist hat and look at this, I think the strategy of 90-90-90 as a single strategy for every country, let alone for every community, will not be effective with a singular goal. We have to have strategies that are designed for specific communities, specific countries, and specific regions. For example, as indicated, Botswana, Tanzania have achieved great progress. However, that will be blunted if PEPFAR is not continued, let alone expanded. So we could learn the tools or learn the strategy that has worked there. However, the strategy that has worked in Botswana to achieve 90-90-90 may not be fully effective in many other regions. So we have to tailor. This is an opportunity to learn. I think that a singular strategy to achieve a goal which is so complex seems to be non-scientific.
So at this time, I think we should hear from those who've been assigned to listen and reflect on our conversation. So they are, Dr. Dash was supposed to be a reflector, but I enlisted him to join the panel. The other reflectors are Dr. Vladimir Berthold, who runs the HIV clinic here at Meharry. He's been doing that for a long time. Vladimir, would you mind making your way to the Dr. Sanika Chirwa, who's also involved in our work in Zambia on HIV. Would you mind coming up, and Dr. Paul Juarez, who also is involved in our, yes, Paul, you are a reflector. Oh yes, I'm sorry. Of course. So first, as a reflector, I just want to get your general thoughts about what you've heard. Is there a question that I should have asked that I didn't? Here's another chair.
There is another chair here. Yeah.
Yes. So the idea was for these individuals who have experience in HIV work, whether it's from the social community engagement side or as scientists or as clinicians, to listen to what we've discussed here and share their thoughts. And why don't we start with you, since
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Nikita Tapandira, and I am currently serving as the rotational lead for the HBCU Global Health Consortium. I'm very happy to be here today, and I think that it's right for me to start off with a bit of a disclosure. I was barely a thought to my parents when this pandemic began. But it is vitally important, and I think I'll make my request known amongst this prestigious panel, that there be an increased effort, maybe even upping the ante investment into younger or emerging leaders in this space, like myself, who need your guidance and need you to hold our hands as we move forward and continue addressing the needs that are still pervasive in our communities. I am hopeful in my reflections that there are many new innovative opportunities, particularly with advancements in AI. And I know that we're all kind of holding on to our seats and observing with critical eyes, but I also want to encourage us to embrace the inevitable, which is change. And I think that there's an opportunity here across the generations where there's vast amounts of knowledge to be passed on that can be linked with the spark of innovation and the excitement of what is happening technologically right now. So I implore you, any and all of you, to take me underneath your wing, and those in the audience and those who are listening and tuning in, and help us to bridge the gap where we were not physically present and able to walk through, the halls where you did meet somebody with a new diagnosis and didn't expect to see them 6 months later, and help us to continue the good fight. Lastly, I would say in my reflections that it seems like the world has an understanding now that communities should be the ones at the helm of decision making and giving feedback as to what's appropriate for their communities and what's right, as you said, tailored to their needs. And I do think that that is an opportunity that we are missing in some aspects. And while funding announcements are clear about those expectations, it really needs to translate on the ground where community leaders are at the helm and leading the charge in what's appropriate for their communities, and we have to be apt to listening. Thank you.
Thank you. Vladimir?
Good morning. My name is Vladimir Berto. I'm from Haiti, by the way. And so I live on both sides of the HIV epidemic. So I work both in Haiti and in the US, starting in New York and then now in Nashville for the past 20 years now. And let me start by quoting Dr. Martin Luther King, which said that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So the speakers have laid out how HIV stigma has created a lot of injustice for people living with HIV. So we have to remember, as an HIV provider, we should always remember to advocate for the patients. And my point now, we should not focus on the disease. We should not treat HIV. We have to stop treating HIV. We have to start treating people with HIV and may have other diseases, may have other problems, they may have other issues. So it's not HIV by itself. We did a pilot study here in the Meharry Community Wellness Center to show that you can achieve 100% viral load suppression given this and that. People who have a low level of comorbidities and low level of social determinants of health and who attend their clinic visits on a regular basis, in our clinic, 100% of them are virally suppressed. Those who miss the clinic visit from time to time, they are about 78% virally suppressed. People who have high level of comorbidities, their viral load suppression is about 65%. But the big challenge are for people who have high level of social determinants of health, substance use, behavioral disorders, incarceration, reincarceration, and homelessness, for them, their viral load suppression rate is only 43%. So that's why we have to deal. So the healthcare system that we have very good programs for HIV. The Reinhardt program is the PEPFAR program, but we need to deal with the whole person, not with a disease, HIV. It's very easy to treat HIV. You take a pill once a day, or you take an injection every 2 months. So that's very easy. So, like when you look at the 1990, what's missing in the 1990 model is the retention in care, because that's where the challenge is. People can take medicine, but people don't stay in care. So we have to innovate to find new ways to keep people in care. So that's most challenging, especially when people are aging with the disease. So they develop, say, HIV is no longer their priorities. So they may have a heart failure, they may have kidney failure, etc. And on top of social determinants of health. So I work in Africa, Haiti, and in the US. What always strikes me is that whether it's in Haiti or in Africa, I don't see homeless people. Here in our clinic, 1 out of every 5 patients who walk into the clinic is a homeless person. That should not happen at all in this country. We have enough money to take care of people who are homeless. So we need to revise our model of, it's not just HIV care, but of healthcare. The Obamacare, it was a good step in the right direction, but it's not enough. It's not enough. So Reinhardt is a good step as well, but Reinhardt take care of people in ambulatory care only. So we need to have a big conversation. It's not just a healthcare people, but wellness for people in general. Healthcare is just one part of wellness. So, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Berto. Dr. Chirwa.
Good morning. It's an honor and a privilege to be here this morning and have this opportunity to talk to you all. My name is Sanika Chirwa. Sanika is a Zambian name. I'm a native of Zambia. It means sunshine or sunny. Nothing to do with my forehead. It's just a name. All right. I feel extremely privileged that at this particular meeting, we have in our midst our ambassador, Ambassador Chiwamba from Zambia, who has made this trip together with his wife to be part of this celebration. HIV as an endemic has gone on way too long. And I can't think of a single epidemic in the medical history that has lasted for over 40 years, as has been the case with HIV. And yet we have some of the brightest and brilliant minds in this world that are putting things on the moon, sending things to Mars, and we still haven't come to a resolution with HIV. And so to be part of this fight to get rid of it and end it by 2030, it's a privilege and an honor. In my particular case, we focus on moms and babies. There should be no single woman out there who should be worried about being pregnant and being afraid of passing on the HIV to the baby. I sometimes wonder how it must feel like knowing that I'm a mom who is pregnant, I have HIV, and I'm worried about my baby. So if there is anything we can do to prevent that, we must do that. And I'm part of that fight. Now, how did I get here? I started out I trained in Canada. And when I went there, I went to train as a brain scientist, what they call neuroscientist, neuropharmacologist. And the reason why I did that was because my dad, who was an extremely brilliant man, had seizures. And there was no care in Zambia for him to live a normal, productive life, even though he was an extremely influential man who affected much of what has happened in Southern Africa. So I set out to find why people have seizures and come back and take care of that. That was my goal. But when I was going to Canada to train, Mom also had her own requirement that she wanted me to do. In her mind, I was nothing else but a doctor, a physician. And so she called me aside and made me a promise. Made me promise her that I was going to be that. And the reason for that was that my aunt, her young sister, had fibroids. She always looked pregnant, and it went on for years. And she was the joke of the community. When are you going to deliver? So mom pulled me aside and said, you're going to be a doctor who is going to come back and take care of this problem. And yes, I did train as a physician as well, even though I've never really practiced medicine. But fast forward, here we are, I've combined these two areas together, which now allows me to look both at pregnant and babies, and then follow them through to adulthood and brain and behavior. And so it's an opportunity to be part of a team of schools, HBCU schools. There are 4 of us: Howard, Morehouse, Charles Drew, and Meharry, who are implementing several initiatives in Lusaka, Zambia, as well as Malawi, as you'll probably hear a little bit more as we go on, that are truly making a difference in the fight against HIV and trying to get it to end by 2030. Just the last 2, 3, 4 sentences, just to give an example. Before the onset or the use of antiretroviral agents, if a mom became pregnant and had HIV, the chances of passing on that infection to the baby was anywhere from 15% to 40 to 50%. And we have physicians here who can validate that if I've made a mistake. Since the introduction of the medication, but with proper use of that, we have been able to reduce that to a number that still needs to be gotten rid of, but it's not 15 to 80 or 40%. With the program that you may hear about in this discussion today, with the work that Meharry is doing in Lusaka, in 4 major hospitals that have a catchment size of over 2 million people, we've been able to reduce the infectivity rate in moms and babies from what is estimated to be 11% for the country to less than 1%. That is the fight I'm so proud to be part of, and it is something that I will do with or without pay. And so with that, I'll shut up.
Thank you. Dr. Juarez.
Thank you and good morning. My name is Paul Juarez. I'm professor and vice chair for research in the Department of Family and Community Medicine here at Meharry. And I'm also the executive director of the Institute on Health Disparities, Equity, and the Exposed Zone. A couple of reflections. One is I also sit on a NIH study section with NHLBI. It's a multi-site clinical trial study section. And we get very complex grants to review, very intricate science and all of that. It would be hard-pressed today, regardless of the quality of the science, for any grant to get approved that doesn't demonstrate effective, meaningful community engagement. Okay. Now I want to go back to the mid-'80s because before coming to Meharry, I was at Charles Drew University. It was a postgraduate medical school at the time in Los Angeles. Again, this was a period, this was HIV, AIDS was, really taking over. City of West Hollywood had just become a city. We had ACT UP that was big in this space. And I had an invitation to participate in a meeting called by this new director at NIAID. His name was Anthony Fauci, sort of green behind the ears at that time, is just coming in. He wanted to have a meeting to talk about community and how we deal with this ACT UP group that was out there creating all this confusion for him. And in that meeting, he had brought together, every other person in the meeting was a community physician. And he thought, his interpretation of engaging community was having community physicians participate in clinical trials. And I was pretty young myself at that time, and I raised my hand and I said, Dr. Fauci, I don't think this is what ACT UP is about. They're demanding a seat at the table. they want a voice in what is going on in terms of AIDS and treatment and vaccines, or the research, clinical trials. And again, this, just reflecting over this past 20, at that time, community engagement, that was sort of not where science was. You know, scientists was sort of the ivory tower. And so this notion of involving and engaging community in these discussions was radical, and it didn't sit easy. But so what we've seen over, and really I credit ACT UP, and I don't know that I have never really heard it discussed, but I think I have to give them credit for being out there on the front lines and demanding community involvement that has now led to NIH recognizing the importance of having the voice of community in discussions, in reviews of applications, or participation in clinical trials and other research. And so that, again, that's sort of my reflection. It's been, you know, when I was at Drew, and I was there for 25 years, it was a postgraduate medical school. I was the director of community medicine, the Center for Community Medicine, and so I came in with, you know, this very, same perspective as I have today. And it's been sort of an amazing journey to see this transition at the highest levels of NIH. And that's my story. Thank you.
So I think we do have time to take a few questions from the audience. One of the overarching themes in all this, you know, as I said, I've been working on HIV since 1986. Was involved in the COVID-19 pandemic response to it. And we have a tendency in our country to say that we value all lives the same. Y'all do know that, right? You hear people say that all the time. We value all lives the same. If that were true, young Hispanic and African American males should not have to worry about whether or not they can afford or have access to PrEP. As you've heard, this pill taken once a day or an injection every month or 2 months can protect those lives. But who has $18,000? Do any of us have $18,000 we can pay for? During the pandemic, as I've said, when it became clear that brown and black folks were going to be more devastated by this than the majority population, I have evidence and proof that the attention and focus changed. I've already mentioned that during the height of the drug use, when it was clear that it was mostly people who looked like me that had the problem, it wasn't even on the radar. But as soon as it became clear that non-minorities were suffering from this, all of a sudden, we got a war on drugs. Until and unless, oh, and now we're going to get rid of PEPFAR. Just happens to be that it's focused in Africa, where people there who, I'm sorry, y'all, I'll be done in just a second. The one thing that has to happen to solve this problem and many others is for us, the greatest nation in the world, the greatest nation in history, to fulfill its commitment that all of us are created equal. And as Barney said, it just happens to be, Barney, that the #1 recommendation the Health Equity Task Force put to President Biden is universal health care. That was our #1 recommendation out of those 12 months we spent going back and forth arguing with each other. That the one thing we need to do in our country is make sure health care is available to everyone in the country. And we can't keep saying we value all lives the same when the evidence points to the fact that it's absolutely, positively not true. Okay. Now, Anyone in the audience have a burning question? Yes, ma'am, please. Is there a microphone in there? Oh.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Dr. Lazarus. I'm a former graduate here in the summer in the Preventative Medicine Department at Meharry. I would like to add to Dr. Hildred's and everyone on the panel's opinion, or lack thereof, like the big gaping hole of the future pipeline. I could say, as the pipeline that's coming down from the future, I can't get hired to do these things that you guys are saying that there is need for. The health system, I think you alluded to it, that it's a sick care model, and you're talking about upstream preventative models. This is not that system. And when I am trying to find a job, which is right now, I can't find a job because my skill set is not put into a work position, paid position. It doesn't exist. I'm not an infectious disease doctor. I'm not internal medicine. I'm not family. I'm a preventative medicine board eligible physician. The system looks at me as a non-board certified doctor. So that's a big gaping hole. I'm here, ready to serve, to do all those health equity things, and I don't have a job.
So let me ask Dr. Haas to reflect on the point she just made. Would you mind, David?
Yeah, I'll do my best. I'm trying to distill it in my head completely. There should be opportunity for everyone, including yourself, who is accomplished, talented, skilled, and enthusiastic and wanting to have opportunity to get engaged. So, with regard to HIV, one aspect of this which is I think helpful, is having these very, very large networks of institutions that work together focused on HIV. So in our case, this is a Tennessee Center for AIDS Research, which is this collaboration between Meharry, Vanderbilt, Tennessee Department of Health, and National Cares. And we are just one of many Centers for AIDS Research across the country. There are 20 of these Centers for AIDS Research across the country. And they're all doing very, very different things, and they all have very, very different needs. And so the key is to find exactly, and this is not just for you, but for everybody. If you're interested and have energy, finding where the best opportunities exist. And a place to start is with the Tennessee Center for AIDS Research, and have us work with people and try to reach out and connect and say, here's this person with this skill set, here's what they want to do. Can they do it here? Can they, are there other opportunities? I don't know if that answers your question, but that's. Say that again, please.
But as a preventive medicine physician, you certainly do have a skill set.
But they don't physician, healthcare plan.
We'll talk.
Oh, okay. That's fine.
We'll talk. Your question reflects the point I made earlier, then hear from the ambassador. If public health and health care, sick care, were conjoined as they should be in our country, there'd be lots for you to do in a system like that. But because they're viewed as separate, it makes it very challenging. Ambassador, please.
Right, thank you very much. My question is based on what you mentioned earlier. I know it came as a by the way, but it has a lot of implications, and I would like to have a response whether the rest of the panel members agree with what you mentioned. This is on the political dimension, where you implied like politics being the stumbling block to progress on a number of interventions to be made. And the reason I'm asking is because my own perception is such that medical science, doctors, people like yourselves, have strategically and very well, very ably engaged politics to be where we are now 40 years later. We are here now because of your ability to engage politics better. So I want to just have an understanding of what you said earlier, whether you still feel it's a big problem. Thank you.
Well, I think that we've navigated politics successfully, but I personally don't intentionally engage politicians. They're necessary, but they're not sufficient for the progress that we've made. In my humble opinion, the real progress in fighting HIV came when folks like Reverend Ed Sanders and other community leaders joined the fight. It was clear to me from the beginning this was not going to be solved by physicians and scientists alone, because we're dealing with a virus that's sexually transmitted. In the United States, we can't talk about sex openly and freely like they do in other places. Sex is one of the basic drives, like hunger and thirst. It's the one thing you know people are going to do. They're going to drink, they're going to eat, and they're going to procreate, or there's an instinctive drive to have intercourse. So this whole idea of not talking about it is a big problem. That's what I think made the difference, is when we engaged with community. And when I first arrived here in 2005, Dr. Stephanie Sweet, who was in the audience with us, introduced me to Reverend Sanders, and I made it a point that our HIV center would have a behavioral and social aspect to it, not just science and research. So your point's well taken, Ambassador, that we've had to navigate politics, but I wouldn't say that, for me at least, there was not an overt intention to engage them. Because politicians have one thing on their mind: we getting reelected. They say what they need to say to get reelected, but once they're elected, they do what they want to do. Maybe that's not true in other countries, but that's my reflection here in the United States. Reverend Sanders has a comment, please.
It's just something I want to share with you. And I'm trying to get to an angle where I can look to my right and left and see all of you as I exercise this little exercise I want to give you. I want all of you to say, just follow me in a little conversation here. Because I do think the conversation is very often what's missing. Especially when you talk about a conversation that somehow intersects between issues of faith, spirituality, religion, and science. Okay, put those four things together. I would like for every one of you in the room to turn around and look at somebody and say to that person, sex.
Sex.
The next thing I want to hear you say is, look at that same person or another person, and I want you to say, good sex.
Get really close to the line here.
And the third thing I want you to say, and I want you to say it kind of the way I'm saying it, and lots of it.
And lots of it. Lots of it.
I want you to know, and I especially like the way Paul talked about act up. So I'm the preacher who acts up a lot of times, but it's just to get folks' attention. But I want to tell you this. If you go into just about any church, especially if it's in the tradition of Judeo-Christian, Muslim traditions, you don't have to say it's just about following Jesus. You don't have to say it's about being Muslim. You don't have to say it's about being Jewish. All of them are in Abrahamic traditions. If you think about it for a minute, when the response that Abraham received in terms of what would be the evidence of what had been promised of the Creator, what it said is that the way in which you will know that you're on the path and doing the thing that perhaps is prescribed by our faith. He says if you do those things, that you will have generations that will continue to be born. And it says that there will be evidence by the fact that there will be as many who will come and follow you as there are stars in the sky and sand by the sea. That translates into people. And you talk about this whole business of how you get the conversation going. It's amazing. I do this in churches a lot, okay? Because it's amazing how people won't even begin to say the word sex. But I also want you to understand what all of you in this room just did. The first thing you did was you laughed about it. There was something that made you a little uncomfortable with it. There are ways in which you find yourself thinking about when you do it that way, it translates into something that is not a part of what should be the conversation in the context of faith. Until you get to the point where, whether you're sitting at the table as someone who probably has a pretty broad and significant scientific knowledge, or you're someone who's committed to the way in which your faith, religious, spiritual life might be lived out. My point is just one thing. There's a way in which you have to get to the point where it's not something that triggers in you some kind of discomfort, something that does not allow you to be able to easily carry on the conversation. And if you add to that the ways in which now we have finally become sufficiently open-minded to recognize and to appreciate the many different ways in which sexuality manifests itself. Once you have those things, it's something that you have to deal with. And until you're willing to deal with it, not just in some theoretical, abstract, and in some instances purely in terms of a way of talking about it that goes beyond the heads, over the heads of a lot of people who need to hear what you're trying to say. Until you get to where you can do that, we're not going to be able to deal with answering and solving a lot of what's there. So I know, you'll go home and remember and say, now what did that crazy preacher say? But I will tell you that what I'm saying is the way all of you in this room reacted is exactly the way in which we have to see and appreciate what it is that we're trying to overcome in terms of this point at which the intersection didn't happen. I'm going to tell you one little story, and this is one of my friends who's close enough. And Barney knows I'm going to tell this story. Barney and I were doing a conference together in Philadelphia a number of years ago. And I thought we had made some pretty good presentations. So we had talked about things. And one of the things was stigma. And it's almost like, you're staying, thinking that no one would dare ask you a question. And I think it started by somebody asked the question, do you have children? And it became a challenge even for Barney and I just happen to have daughters who have been friends since they were that tall. And we found ourselves thinking about the fact that we had some, at least momentary hesitation in terms of how we answered the question which was asked of us. Would you recommend that your child, your daughter, be involved in this trial and taking this text? The apprehension that people have, apprehensions, plural, that people have about being involved personally in these studies is something that's still very, very difficult. And I think a part of what I'm always trying to demonstrate when I ask those questions that I was saying to you a few minutes ago is that it's not just the them, the they, and the those. It's also the we, the our, and the us. Because most of us don't easily deal with issues of human sexuality, especially when it's very close to us and the people we love and the people we share life with every day. But anyway, you got to have the conversations, and you got to have the conversations if you're the researcher, or if you're the believer, or if you're a person who just sees the whole business of spirituality as being central. I'm not a person who would argue that it has to be any particular faith tradition, because I think everybody believes something. In some instances, you might not disagree, but you might disagree. But I'm going to sit back down and just say to you, I hope that each one of us will allow ourselves to be the ambassadors who are willing to carry the message to others, even when it might not be at the top of the agenda in terms of what you came to talk about. Yes, if you don't get it to the point where you're dealing with the issues that are grounded in words like, I guess the word that I hear all the time is people talking about HIV as a sexually transmitted disease. Well, if it's a sexually transmitted disease, at some point you have to realize there's a lot of time and energy that needs to be invested in figuring out that it has to be a conversation that you're willing to be engaged in. And you can't do it very well unless you're willing to honor the words of one of the great philosophers of the 20th century, Michael Jackson. And Michael Jackson's word was what? It's about the person in the mirror.
There you go.
And until you understand that and work out how you're going to deal with it, it's going to be hard for you to ever effectively work out how others are going to deal with it until you figure out how to establish a common language that takes you beyond the obstacles that keep us from talking freely with them. Okay. Whenever I hear PEPFAR, I have to tell you this one thing. President Bush had determined and asked me if I would consider being the person who would be one of the lead persons for that initiative in the world. But he found out that I was engaged, or his people found out that I was engaged in one of the strategies that was becoming very popular, very much a part of what was going on. He actually, they found out that I was involved in the whole business of trying to make access to syringes, because everybody got so caught up in dealing with just the fact of a sexually transmitted disease. The fact is that at one point, at the height of this whole reality related to HIV, it was because of the lack of willingness to deal with syringe exchange. And that had already at that point been determined by CDC. That might be one of the most effective ways to respond to curbing the spread of HIV. So when you talk about stigma, just think that there's a lot of things that you have to be willing to bring into the picture and figure out how you're going to talk about it. And until we have those conversations, it's going to be hard. All right, so.
Thank you, Reverend Sanders. I don't want the ambassador to think that we ignored his question. So I want to ask my three senior colleagues who've been in the fight as long as I've been or longer, do you think that we've done a good job of engaging politicians to get us to where we are?
So I'll just comment quickly. I don't engage politicians, but I think a key aspect that we really haven't touched on for research is, we talk about basic science, epidemiology, public health, all these aspects. Another really, really key aspect of research is in public policy and understanding the impact of public policies on health, on economics, on all these things. So unless you can go to the politicians with data, the data may not win the day, but without the data, it's going to be hard to win the day. So locally in Tennessee, one thing that led to the state approving needle exchanges were analyses done by our CFAR to show that the policies that would allow this would prevent epidemics of hepatitis and HIV, and that was enough to win the politicians, among other things, to actually legislate in favor of needle exchanges. So,
But David, that was back when the politicians were rational.
yes, yes. Things tend to swing back. I'm optimistic that things will swing. I'm very optimistic.
Barney?
Well, what I work on now is more policy. I talk about science a lot, but I work more on policy. But I feel like, and that interfaces with politics, but I feel like I'm working sort of at the third level down from where we need to be. And I'm sorry, but I'm going to show my idealism again in deference to my friend and pastor, Reverend Sanders. If we could achieve the beloved community that Martin Luther King and John Lewis talked about, where everyone loves one another, and love is sometimes even harder to talk about than sex, we would not have any of these problems. And the second tier would be if we could eliminate poverty, we would not have any of these problems. So I work on the third level down, doing the best I can in the meantime on policy, and science is probably a few steps below that, but until we really reach up to that higher level of engagement, I'm afraid we're sort of destined to, have the troubles that we have. And anyway, so I'm doing what I can in the meantime, the best I can at the level of policy and maybe politics and science, but we really have to get to that other place like Reverend Sanders is talking about.
A couple of things. Most of you have Netflix at home. There's a movie out about the story of Bayard Rustin called Rustin. If you watch that, you will see that all of the politics in the world doesn't bring everyone together, doesn't help everyone understand each other. But eventually, if you engage the next generation, you can make a difference. I think in terms of the politicians, I guess I was remembering the very first AIDS march and demonstration on City Hall in Chicago. I was standing next to Dr. Renslow Shear, and he said, "Is this about gay rights or health?" I said, "Both." We have to let go of some of our own personal barriers. And then this last thing is, even after you engage community sometimes, community doesn't always get it right. I was doing needle exchange. I remember the time I had to go to the hospital and see a friend who was helping us do the needle exchange. And he had just contracted HIV, and he said, "You didn't tell us that we not only had to use clean needles, but we needed to wear condoms, because we had sex sometimes to get our drugs." So you have to have different levels of engagement with different communities, because everybody's not going to tell you everything that they do. But I think we still need to talk to the politicians. I think we still need to hold them accountable. And I think we need sometimes just to be in the room where they are, because they know what you stand for once you've established yourself. I've gotten on an airplane and had the state senator say, "Not today." And I said, "All right, ma'am, no problem, not today." But if you establish yourself as somebody who's going to bring the issues to the politicians, you'll continue to have access.
Could I just have a follow-up to that? It's a perfect segue, and I've been thinking about a group, a rising group that's becoming more influential that I think is being left on the table and part of this conversation and more broad equity issues are influencers themselves. I had a high-level person at a medical school tell me that they were having a meeting with someone and they didn't know the person that was setting up the meeting that said, "You've got to," it was another word other than influencer, and it actually turned out to be a really funny joke. But the reality is the way the money is moving is shifting, and that is the writing is on the wall, and this is a comment to the ambassador in particular. The way that we, as communities, are engaging politicians is shifting. And if we miss the opportunities to engage where the money is flowing, it's looking a lot different. Advertisement as an industry has changed, and it's coming back into the power of people because of our access to technology. So I'd be careful to not be so quick to laugh off the number of followers that are being shared by people on TikTok or Instagram, the millions of people that they have captive audience to every single day, which are adequately and significantly supported by dollars and other types of currency, cryptocurrency. Don't put that in your pocket. Those are the people that need to be lobbying, and they need to be advocating, and they have the platforms to be talking about the things that are important to their communities, and they are. And they have money, and they're putting it and backing it up against the things that they support. So if you're not that apt to engaging politicians directly, look to those who have the ears of the people in the communities that you're serving. They have the money, and they have their attention.
So that's all true, but at the end of the day, the politicians focus on those who vote. Because if you don't vote, you're irrelevant to them. That's just a plain and simple truth. So the bottom line is that the solution to a lot of our problems is for the complaining folks to go to the ballot box and vote. And if you don't vote, you have no right to complain, in my humble opinion. So that's one message that we can deliver today. But let me acknowledge the presence of our colleagues from HRSA with us today. Thank you all for being here. We appreciate it. And could you join me in thanking our panelists for a great symposium? And with that, I'm going to bring our symposium to a close. Thank you all for being here.